What's going on, guys? My name is Johnny. Welcome back to the shop. This week we're making this queen size bed. Let's get started. This bed is made from solid walnut plywood, and steel. I don't have much experience working with metal, so it was pretty fun working with something new. The first part I'm tackling in this project is the box that acts as the footboard. The four sides are solid walnut and the back panel is walnut ply. I prefer to work with solid wood as often as I can, but I used plywood for the back so I don't have to worry about designing and building around wood expansion and contraction. What you've seen me do so far is rip the top and bottom boards to width. Next, I tape them together and crosscut one end to make it square. Then I flip it around to cut the other side. I got lucky here, and where I placed one of the pieces of tape is actually exactly where I needed to cut it. So I used that piece of tape to line up the cut. Taping them together makes sure that they're exactly the same length. And once that's all done, I can remove the tape and add it to my giant tape ball. This is all the blue tape I've used in projects this past year. The next pieces to cut were the short sides of the box. I used the offcut from the top board so that the grain and color match perfectly. I draw a bevel on these pieces so that they can flow seamlessly from the top board and the narrower bottom board of the box. A tapering jig would work great here, but I don't have one, so I lined up this line with the kerf of my crosscut sled, and I held it securely to make the cut. I don't recommend doing this if you're not comfortable with it, as the piece can twist and cause kickback, and that can be extremely dangerous. This box is being put together with dowel joinery, so I marked the center line of the boards and drilled the holes for dowels. I came up with a far too complicated way to hold these boards to my drill press table. I used a wooden clamp to keep them from spinning, and I clamped a square to the table to make sure I was drilling perfectly square. After drilling the holes, I remembered my table tilts all the way to 90 degrees, so I could have clamped the face of the board directly onto the table, which would have made it a lot easier. To transfer these hole locations to the top and bottom boards, I'm using dowel centers. This is the first time I've ever used them, and I highly recommend including them into your workflow. I just line up the back and sides of the boards with a square, and I press it down to leave indent in the bottom board. Then I drill right in these locations using a flag on my drill bit to make sure I drill to the proper depth. Next, I cut the dowels to length on my crosscut sled, and after all of that, I can finally put the dowels in and see if all of these holes lined up. I repeated the same process to line up and drill the holes in the top board. Next, I need to cut a stopped rabbet on the top and bottom boards to accept the back panel. I clamped a straight edge to the board for my router to ride up against, and cut the rabbet in 2 passes. Lining up the straight edge took a bit longer than I anticipated, so after cutting these grooves, I bought an edge guide for my router, which comes in handy later on in this build. I then came back and squared up the corners with a chisel. The back panel of this box is a cutoff from the headboard, which we'll get to later on in this video. I cut this panel to size, slowly sneaking up to a nice snug fit. I then put this box together and clamped all the pieces in place so that I can add a few screws from the bottom. This adds a bit of strength, but it also helps me during the glue up, so I won't have to mess with clamps. With that all done, I can start putting it all together. I start with gluing the bottom and back panel to each other and use the screws to hold them in place. Next, I glue on the side panels. I made sure to add plenty of glue in the dowel holes since this is the only long grain to long grain connection, and it's really what's holding everything together. After attaching the top, I can start clamping it all together. The next day, I took off the clamps and set the box aside so I could start working on the bed frame. The frame is mainly made out of 4 solid walnut stretchers, and I start by cutting a rabbet on the 2 outer ones. This rabbet is where the slats of the bed will be attached to. Next, I use a miter saw to square up one end of these boards and cut them to length. The saw wasn't able to cut the full thickness, so I had to finish the last ½ inch with a handsaw. While at the miter saw, I also cut the center stretchers to length. To tie these stretchers together, I'm experimenting with a new type of wood called steel. This stuff is extremely hard, and I ended up going through a couple drill bits. After countersinking these holes, I can transfer the hole locations into the wood and screw all the parts together. Adding paste wax to the screws helps them go in much easier. I also pre-drilled and screwed in the footboard box. Next, I took everything apart and I had to remove a section from the center stretchers, so the slats I add later on will be able to sit flat. If you're not comfortable making a cut like this on the table saw, you can make this entire cut either with a jigsaw or bandsaw. The table saw wasn't able to make the entire cut, so I used a handsaw to clean up the sections that the table saw wasn't able to reach. These two center stretchers are cutoffs from the side stretchers, but I turned them 90 degrees so that they would be thicker. Because of this, I need to create a pocket that the legs will sit in. That way they will be even with the legs I add on the side stretchers later on. These legs were made by my buddy Chris from Make Everything. If you don't already follow him, you should definitely check out his YouTube channel and his Instagram. He does everything from metalworking, woodworking, leather, and tool restorations. You can check out his work by clicking the links down in the description. Thank you for making these legs, Chris. They are incredibly heavy and overbuilt, which is perfect because the rest of the bed is exactly the same way. After screwing the legs on, I moved on to finishing all of these parts with wipe-on poly. I added a total of 3 coats. Moving on to the headboard, I ripped 2 sheets of plywood into 12-inch panels. This made them much easier to move into their final destination, but I kept the bottom 3 panels as one unit. This is to add some stability since this is where the head of the bed will be supported. Next, I add a rabbet on the end of each panel, and this is how they'll be screwed into the wall. I cut this rabbet using a router, and I add blue tape to reduce the risk of tear out on the thin walnut veneer. The last pieces needed are the caps that run vertically on the ends of the headboard. I cut a rabbet on them using the table saw, and that's how the screws on the plywood panels will be covered. After cutting them to length, a lot of sanding, and finishing all the parts, I can start with the install. I made this bed as a gift for my brother. We start with attaching the headboard to the wall, but first we add these strips to add a gap between the two so that we can run wires and lighting in the future. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you'll get notified when that video comes out, because we have some pretty cool ideas. Next, we line up the headboard panels on the floor so that we can get a nice configuration of the boards. We then screw them onto the end strips and use a brad nailer to attach them to the center strips. Next, we assembled the frame, centered it, and screwed it into the headboard. We then screwed on the footboard box and used a brad nailer to tack in the headboard caps. These slats are 1x4s cut to length and screwed in place. We then centered the rug, cleaned up the tools, and brought in the mattress. And with that, it's all done. Thank you guys for sticking around to the end. If you have any questions about this build, you can leave them down in the comments and I'll be more than happy to answer them. If you want to check out Chris's video on how he made the legs, you can click right up here, and down here is another video that YouTube thinks you like. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.